Hi, and welcome to this introduction video tutorial of the C# beginner video series for the Stride game engine. In this tutorial, we will learn how to set up the C# beginner template project. We will learn about the types of script that we can attach to the entities in our game. We learn a little bit about how we can log information to a console, and we learn how to set up debugging with Stride. These video tutorials cover the absolute basics that you need to know when you're starting out with game development in general or with the Stride game engine. Do note that these tutorials do not serve as an introduction to the C# programming language or the concepts within object-oriented programming. So if you're not familiar with terminology like methods, classes, and inheritance, then I do recommend you learn a little bit about these topics beforehand. But of course, feel free to tag along and see how you like things with Stride. So let's start out by creating the C# beginner template project that comes with the Stride game engine. As you can see, I've opened up the Stride launcher and I've installed the latest beta version, in this case for the Stride game engine. I'm going to start a new project. Up next, we get the project selection screen, and all the way to the left, here in the middle, we have the Tutorials tab. Here we can select the C# beginner template project, and all we have to do now is give it a nice name. We select this, and then the platform window opens. For now, we're going to create this on Windows. Feel free to select a different platform if you want to include this for your project. For the entire C# beginner series, we will be using the Windows project only. Once we've clicked OK, the project will be created and you will get a fresh template with all the C# beginner tutorials inside them. Since there are various assets being used by this C# project, the setting up will take some time, up to around a minute on my computer. And as you can see, it's been added to the projects list in the Stride launcher. And now that the Stride Game Studio has been opened, notice how in the bottom right the thumbnails are being built. Currently there are 516 in the queue, which will take a while. So for now, we'll skip that in this video so that we can get started right away. So now that all the thumbnails and all the assets have been pre-built, let's have a look at what we're seeing right now in our scene. So in the middle, we have our scene view of the main scene. And if we look around that scene a little bit, you can see the basic overview or the main scene where all the tutorials are going to be loaded into as a sort of demonstration per tutorial subject. To the left, you can see various sub-scenes that all contain a specific topic that we're going to learn about in these C# beginner video tutorials. All these scenes are hidden by default, and if we would start our game right now by pressing the play button or by using the F5 keyboard shortcut, we will build the game and then we can actually start snooping around in these example scenes. Once the game has been built and actually started, we are presented with a menu that contains all of the separate tutorials that we can view individually. For instance, we could click on this Getting a Component tutorial. The camera will fly to the specific tutorial that we're going to cover, and every tutorial will have some text printed to the screen. At any given moment, you can open the menu again and select a different tutorial for you to check out. Per tutorial that we have here in our main scene, we have a separate video that shows you a specific concept that you as a starter should really know about. All the code that is used in this project can also be found in the online documentation at stride3d.net underneath the tutorials section. There you can open every single tutorial, read its description, and read any additional comments that are placed in every single code file that is being used by every tutorial. Now let's start creating our first script. In the bottom left here, you can see the solution that is actually our game. And if we select that code folder right now, let's add a subfolder there by clicking the right mouse button on it. Let's create a folder. We're gonna just type tutorial. And then in the asset view, notice how there's nothing there yet. And we're gonna start adding our scripts there. So we're gonna click on the Add Asset button. And then we're gonna go to this Script tab. And every single project that we create with the Stride Game Engine or with Stride Game Studio, it comes with a bunch of example scripts as well as a couple of very useful scripts like animation blending or scene streaming. And for this tutorial, we're only going to focus on the top 3 scripts that you see here, because every script that we want to attach to an entity and we want to create game logic in it, well, we have 3 kinds of option there. There is the asynchronous script, which is a script that is implemented as a single task, and you can perform async operations with it, or the typical await operations on it. So this is very useful for if you want to create a task that you want to await its functionality on, like saying awaiting until there is a certain collision trigger, or if you want to retrieve data from a web API, which can take several milliseconds or even up to several seconds. For the C# beginners course, we will not go into detail about the async script. We will leave that to the intermediate C# tutorials. What we will be using a lot during this beginner's course is the synchronous or sync script. So let's create a sync script first. I'm going to call this demo sync script. And as you can see, it's being created inside the asset view. And I'm going to directly add another script, which is called the startup script, which looks a lot like the sync script, but it's even smaller. It's got even less functionality, and we'll see about that in a second. So let's create that. Start demo script. And once that has been created, let's open it in the code editor of Stride Game Studio by double clicking on it. And as you can see, it's being opened inside Game Studio itself. It's not opened in an external IDE. Now we can start coding right here if we wanted to, but for the entire series of the C# beginners course, we will be using Visual Studio as our main IDE. But just in case you don't want to, you can always code everything you want right here in Stride Game Studio. So let's have a look at the script that we've just created that has been generated for us. If we go back to our scene and we select an entity that is in our scene, and this could be any kind of entity really, especially for the sake of this tutorial, it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to select the main camera that's been placed at the top corner of our little structure here. If we click on Add Component in the property grid of our selected camera, and we type in the name of either one of our scripts, notice how we get that script up appearing here in this list of components. So let's add demo sync script and as well as the start script that we've made. And now they're being attached to this entity. And this is a really important concept for the Stride Game Engine. The Stride Game Engine is a component-based game engine. You don't have to use this if you don't want to, but this is pretty much the philosophy of this game engine. You have entities in your scene and you attach one or more components to a single entity to get it to behave in a certain way. Now let's have a look at that start demo script. So I'm just going to go back to that start demo script, and that means that if we would run our game right now, then as soon as our scene would be loaded, then this start method that we have here, this public void start method, it will be invoked. And that is actually the only thing that this script does. If we would put any code in here, then that code would be executed only once, and that's all this script does. So this startup script is very useful in case you just want to initialize something, like the spawner of an enemy. Now let's have a look at that other script that we've made, the sync script. This script we're going to open inside Visual Studio. And we can do this in various ways. And one of the ways we can do this is by clicking on the Open in IDE button, which is what we're going to do right now. So this will open Visual Studio for me. And I have Visual Studio Community Edition installed, which is the edition which you can download for free. And then in my case, I have the Solution Explorer to the right. In your case, it might be to the left or at a completely different location. And I'm going to open the C# beginner tutorial, or the name of our project, how we created it, followed by .game. That's where our script is going to reside. And that's where we created our two scripts. And you can see them in our Solution Explorer overview. And I'm going to select that demo sync script. So as you may notice, if you look at this demo sync script, it looks a lot like the startup script. The difference here is that it inherits from sync script instead of startup script. The start method is here as well, so far it's almost identical, but we get this bonus method, which is called the update method. And this method, as the comment already kind of explains, it will be called every single time our game is going to be updated. So if we would run our game on a super fast computer and it would be running an empty scene with 2000 frames per second, then this update method would be called 2000 times per second. Now let's start adding some code to our script so that it actually does something. One of the first things that you will learn is how to log information to the console that launches at the same time as your game. We can do so by saying log.debug and then putting some text between the parentheses. By default, the debug level will not be displayed in the console because we have to set the activity or the severity level of our log. However, we can display warnings right off the bat. Debug text will appear in light gray if you set the activity level to verbose or all kind of activities. Warnings will be printed out in yellow. Now that we've written our first code, let's build and run our game. We can do this directly from Visual Studio, or we can hop on over back to Stride Game Studio and launch the game from there. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to start it directly from Visual Studio. So as you can see, our game has started, and if we move that window to the right just a little bit, notice how we have this console in the background. Now, as said, the debug level is not shown by default because we haven't set the severity level for this particular script. However, all warnings and higher level severity logs will be printed out to the console. Every time we do this, the name of our script is printed to the console, followed by the severity level, and then followed by the message that we put between the parentheses. Let's first add a little line to the update method of our script and add a little information. And in order for us to set a breakpoint, which is used to stop our program, I'm just going to use the F9 shortcut, or we can click on the side line here to set a breakpoint in our script. Now, if we would run our game directly from Visual Studio, which will happen a lot if you do a lot of programming, then we will always trigger these breakpoints if the update script is being invoked. However, it is also possible that we run our game directly from Stride Game Studio. In that case, we have to do it a little bit different. But let's first start the game directly from Visual Studio. As soon as the game has launched, notice how we're triggering this yellow breakpoint in our script. So our game has been halted and we can see any variables, any values that have been set. Now let's do the exact same thing, but this time directly from Stride Game Studio. All we have to do is go back to Stride Game Studio, save any changes in case you haven't done so, and launch the game from there. So right now our game has started, so our breakpoint from our game has not been triggered, and that's because Visual Studio hasn't started the project, but Stride Game Studio has. But we can still attach our Visual Studio code directly to the ongoing process that is our game. All we have to do is go back to Visual Studio, click on Debug, then going to Attach to Process, which by default has the Ctrl-Alt-P shortcut, and then we get a list of applications that are currently running. So if we would type in Stride, we will get the Stride application that is running, which is Stride Game Studio. We don't want that. It's also not stride.x, which is the Stride launcher, but instead we should type in the name of our project, which is the C# beginner tutorial. Once we've found that, we can either double click or select it and click on Attach. And as soon as we do that, our Visual Studio project has been attached to our running game, and as you can see, the breakpoint is being triggered right away. And that pretty much concludes this introduction tutorial for the C# beginner series for the Stride game engine. I hope you learned something from this video. Always feel free to leave a comment, or if you have any questions, you can either go to the forum of the Stride engine or log on to the Discord server of Stride. And we will see you around for the next video tutorials in the C# playlist.